So, if you're watching this, hopefully you have read the chapter, looked at the sources and approaches to competitive advantage introduced there, and thought about that some. And with that as a backdrop, I want to introduce an alternative view. We'll talk a little later about whether it is a competing view or a complementary view or exactly where it fits versus the others. But let's start with a little background on it, reminder, and then look at the alternative view. So, I introduced earlier in the introduction this notion that there are differing assumptions about the nature of competitive advantage, that the traditional view came more from industry structure as the driver, and that the current, more popular, if you will, view, um, resource-based or dynamic capabilities, considers the notion of competitive advantage arising from market disequilibrium. That is, it accepts the notion that markets change and firms have to respond to those, and not that those aren't necessarily just a threat. They in fact provide opportunities for gaining advantage. Right, so we showed this model that says that these changes can come from external sources, uh, in which case different firms have differing abilities to respond and differing speeds of response, and that also firms can sometimes drive the changes, those internal sources of change. But then, and again, this is kind of always bugged me, found interesting, challenging, is that you come back then to, even within that model, this traditional view of positioning as to low cost and differentiation being the primary means of gaining a competitive advantage. Um, kind of the challenge to this that I see is that while the low cost and differentiation notion do align with our view of strategy as how a firm is going to compete and gain an advantage, they do so in a particular competitive arena at a point in time. So they are worthwhile, they are helpful, but there is something that is missing. And they don't really address the question of how a firm's going to respond to the idea of changes in those competitive arenas. Even though we've just said that the kind of consensus view today is that opportunities really come from change. So, how do we deal with that? Well, there is an alternative approach out there, another view, if you will. It comes from Miles and Snow, initially as well a couple of other authors, Hank Coleman, and Alan Meyer. It was introduced at just about the same time as Michael Porter's. It was an interesting time in the strategy field, the late 1970s into the early 80s. But where Porter has his roots in economics, Miles and Snow have their roots in management and organization theory. So they look at the world in kind of a different way. They take what I would argue is a more holistic organizational approach with roots in, or closer to what would come to be called the resource based or the dynamic capabilities point of view. In their notion, the focus is really on maintaining fit over time in the face of change. If you'll recall from back in chapter 1, we talked about the fact that strategy is this link between the firm and its environment. Right? That to be successful, a firm has to have a strategy that both addresses the demands in the industry, but also that is supported by the goals and values, the resources and capabilities, and the structures and systems. What Miles and Snow argue is that if in fact we assume that things change over time, we need to consider how firms respond and deal with these changes. With that idea in mind, Miles and Snow start with the notion of an adaptive cycle, right? And balancing what they call the entrepreneurial problem, the engineering problem, and the administrative problem, and that a firm must balance and continue to adjust these things over time to respond to changes in the competitive arena. That is, it's not just hitting fit once, it's being able to maintain that fit over time. Let's look at each of these pieces in turn. So, the entrepreneurial problem might be what we would call strategy, or at least part of strategy. It is the choice of the product and market domain. What are you going to sell? And again, I say product, but it's always product or service. But what are you going to sell? Who are you going to sell it to? Where are you going to compete? And kind of what's your philosophy on that as things change over time? In addition, there is the engineering problem. What are you going to use in the way of technologies for production and distribution of your products and services? And technology here is this broad notion of what are you using to change inputs into an output, adding value along the way that the market wants. The third piece of the puzzle is the administrative problem. This is really the structures and processes, things we talked about in the last lesson. What kind of structures are you going to use? How are you going to manage the systems to utilize your engineering choices to support the entrepreneurial choices? And so we put arrows in here suggesting that all of these things have to work together over time. And again, this is not a one-time thing. This is a continual adaptive process for firms. So, what are the options when you think about this adaptive cycle? Can we see any patterns in what firms do or differences? Well, it turns out that, yeah, there really are. That if you look within an industry, in fact, if you go talk to managers within an industry, they can almost always identify firms that fit into one of several categories. So, let's start with the prospector. The prospector is the one that, in answering the entrepreneurial question, says we want to be the one that drives change in the marketplace. We want to continually look to locate, develop, exploit new product and market opportunities. So we want to be the one that is innovative. We want to be the one, again, that is driving the change in the marketplace. If that's the case, then how do you deal with the engineering problem? Well, your challenge there is to manage it in such a way that you avoid any long-term commitments to a single technology process, because you don't want to get locked into a single approach as you're trying to move on to new areas. It's not that the prospector just gives up on new things after a period, but they're only going to stay in that market if they can do so at a higher price, still getting returns to their entrepreneurial, if you will, innovative approach. Then we've got to think about the administrative problem. If you're going to be regularly trying to locate and exploit new product and market opportunities with a very flexible technology system, well, you've got to be able to manage a number of diverse operations, because you're going to have some that are at different kind of stages along the way. You got to think about how you can manage that. How do you incentivize people to continue to look for new things? What do you do with the things that have already been out there, and how do you manage those? So these create a set of challenges, but they are one approach, the prospector approach, to dealing with change. Let's be the change agent rather than responding to change, is kind of the underlying philosophy. As a kind of the complete other end of the spectrum from that is the notion of a defender. The defender, in answering the entrepreneurial question, says, how do we seal off a piece of the market? How can we create stability in the face of change? Are there niches we can get into? Are there particular products, segments of the markets that tend to stay more stable over time? Those are the ones that we want to address. Doesn't mean that things don't ever change, and it just means that we want to make them as stable as we can because we don't want to be changing all the time. If that's the case, now we've got a different engineering problem. Here we've got to figure out how to produce goods or services as efficiently as possible. Doesn't always mean lowest cost, but it does mean efficient and effective for serving that stable niche that you have chosen to serve. Again, if that's the case, then what do you do administratively with your structures and processes? Well, here we've got more of a control approach where the prospector was a little more open. In terms of the last chapter, the prospector would be more organic, the defender would be more mechanistic probably. Because they know what they're trying to serve. They're trying to be efficient and effective in doing that. They set up a different set of structures and processes to deal with it. And again, this is an ongoing challenge. The defender says, let's see what we can do in terms of our choice of products and markets to minimize changes that we're going to have to face. Not do away with, but minimize. In between these two extremes, the prospector and the defender, lies the analyzer. The analyzer, the true analyzer, you can think of as a second in, where the prospector is the first in and the driver. The analyzer sits back and watches these new changes being done and tries to quickly follow those that they think have the most potential. So they don't want to take quite the risk in introducing new things, but they are a quick second. They want to follow. So their entrepreneurial problem is how do you locate and exploit new opportunities while at the same time maintaining a base of more traditional products and customers, because the analyzer doesn't want to give up quite as quickly as a prospector might as they are moving into new areas. This creates an interesting set of engineering problems because now you need to be more like the defender, more efficient in stable portions, but be flexible and responsive in changing portions. In particular, they often, as an analyzer, want to see the things the prospectors are doing and figure out a way to make it better, less expensive, adjust features, whatever, with their second in, following the leaders into the new product and market opportunities. Now you've got an administrative problem that goes with that, because you've again kind of got two different worlds here. And you've got to figure out structures and processes that allow you to accommodate both stable and dynamic arenas. And that can be a real challenge. The analyzers, some have argued, I'm not sure if I fully agree, but I understand the argument, to say that the analyzer is potentially the most profitable, but also potentially the most challenging to operate because of its dual nature. And if you've done the reading, you'll recognize, and if not, do read the article, their original introduction of the typology, and you'll read about the reactor. The firm that doesn't take a clear approach, an analyzer can fall into a reactor's bit fairly easily if they don't manage their whole process well. So, kind of summarizing the Miles and Snow approach. Right, the adaptive cycle really directly addresses the notion of change in the market and how a firm responds. It wants to give a firm a consistent approach so that it knows there is going to be change. What is our approach? Are we going to lead the change as a prospector? Are we going to try to minimize changes as the defender? Or are we going to take an intermediate approach as the analyzer? It does look at both internal as well as external challenges. That is, it is holistic. Thinks about the nature of the environment, but also what you must do inside the firm to maintain these things. And really, while the language is slightly different, because the resource-based view and dynamic capabilities and some of those things really weren't developed until after 10 years or more after the typology was first introduced. It really does build on the notion of firm capabilities, the role of structure and processes in developing and maintaining these, and I say this whole package that goes with it rather than just a position in the market uh, as Porter does. So, if you have not done so already, do go read the original. Read the readings that I have posted in the readings folder, the original Miles and Snow article from 1978. And then if you're interested as well, you can take a look at a 2003 interview, kind of at the 25-year anniversary. Kind of interesting to see what they think about what has become of their typology over time. Like Porter, it is still being used to this day. They are the two of a number that were introduced over the 80s and the 90s that are still in use and still seem to be of value. Then give some thought as to kind of how they compare in their approach versus the Porter generic strategies. And then we'll turn to some discussion and let you kind of post some ideas about what you think of all that.